Okay, what's up, everybody? We're going to start our week 2 live session here. Looks like we already got a couple people hanging out in the chat. Hope everyone's having a pretty good week so far. I just went through all the 2.1 grades. Been trying to leave feedback on everybody for that one. For anyone that's already taken the time to look at the 2.1 critique, you are probably aware that I messed something up in the activity. I had a whole chunk of the documentation that was completely missing, which I realized pretty quickly after going through the first couple of videos because a couple of people were missing the same exact thing. And then I went back to the activity and started looking at what happened, and there was just a slide and a bunch of numbers were missing. So I tried to leave everyone feedback about it. I've already fixed the activity documentation. So if you guys go back to 2.1, you'll see that it does look a little different. There's a whole new step and slide that was there that wasn't there before. But anyway, today we're going to talk about some other stuff. We're still going to do some set project things, just as a really quick review. It's pretty straightforward though, and I think everyone that had turned that one in did a really good job with it. But today we're going to be getting into some other kind of fun things, which is more about project organization. We're going to go over a bunch of really cool ways just to keep your stuff clean, some little tricks like using groups, display layers. We're going to use it with the character project and the environment project. So it should be pretty fun. All right. So let me just fix one thing on my secondary monitor real quick so I can see everybody. Okay. Cool. So real quick, I just want to make sure everyone can hear me. Are you guys able to hear my audio okay? It looks like it's working because I can see in the little preview it seems like it's buffering okay. So I'll just give you guys a second here just to respond before I jump into it. Cool. All right. I have verification. We're good to go. Let's do this. All right. So I'm going to bring in the documentation super quick for 2.2. You guys kind of know the drill from last week with the live session. Really, as long as you guys are hanging out with me today and, soaking in the sights and sounds, you're already getting credit for this one. Just upload the little screenshot to the activity. You automatically get a few points. And then the big thing we're going to talk about is more to do with 2.3. Now, of course, just like every other activity, I do have a playlist that goes through a bunch of videos or a bunch of different techniques and tools in much more detail, like how groups work, different things to do in the outliner. But for the live session, I'm going to kind of do a more of a broad overview on everything and how these tools relate to your project. So the character project, the environment project. There's a lot of different steps in this one, but they're all fairly straightforward. I just had to break it up into a lot of pages so it's a little bit easier to follow instead of throwing all this information into one slide, which I used to have before. But all right, let's jump in here. Oh, one thing too I wanted to point out, just in case you guys don't know about this, do you all know about the control middle mouse wheel? So I'm holding control and a middle mouse wheeling up and back. It basically changes it's a shortcut for changing the scale of your browser if you're in Chrome. So if you do control and middle mouse wheel up, you can zoom in a bit closer to help see the LMS, just in case you're having a hard time seeing some of the information. Because I know since we're using these 4K displays, it doesn't really scale too well, and sometimes the text is really hard to see. And if you scroll back with control, you can put it back to 100%. You can also do it right here with the little magnifying glass. It's pretty handy. Yeah, I didn't know about that for the longest time. I actually was doing it by mistake for months, and I started wondering why certain pages just seemed like they were so tiny, and I had accidentally zoomed back and scaled out, and I didn't even realize it. So, the more you know. All right. So what I'm going to do is let's grab the character project first. I actually have to copy that. I thought I had it on my desktop, but apparently not. I am completely unprepared for this, apparently. Hey, Alicia. Welcome to the party. We haven't really done too much yet. I'm basically just going to be going over some things for 2.3. So your fun goals for the weekend. And this is going to be the last week where we're doing a lot of technical things in Maya as far as like organization and folders and all that stuff. Starting next week, we're going to be getting into making our first digital images. So you guys are going to be creating lights, rendering images, designing your own compositions. It's going to be pretty fun for you guys, I think, to finally jump in there with RenderRain and do that stuff. All right, so we will start with. I'm just going to start with maybe part of the character project. I'll open this up so you can see it. So the main goal for the camera project, we're going to be starting with what you guys had before. So we're still using the same camera file from 1.3. You guys have it in your project folder from 2.1. So since you guys have gone through 1.3, 2.1, everything should be kind of ready and good to go. So what I'm going to do is we've already got Maya open. Let's just do a really quick run through of the whole project set thing, which you guys are pretty familiar with at this point. We have Maya open. What's the very first thing we do? Remember, we don't open the file. We always go to set project immediately. And I know a lot of you from watching the videos were coming down here to set project right there. I do want to show you a shortcut, and I don't remember if I go over it in the video. I might, but the way I typically do it isn't through here. I'm showing you guys this because this is technically the way that Maya has it set up, but there is a more efficient way to do it if you want to save a little bit of time. So usually what I do is I'll hit the open button right here. So I don't even go into the menu at all. I go to open, and you'll notice in the open window in the bottom left corner, there's a button that says set project. Yep, and if you guys know your shortcuts, if you don't want to hit the little folder, because that's a lot of work moving your mouse those 3 inches, right? We could also do Control O, which is even a little bit faster. So once you start getting into those hotkeys, that's even better. But either way, when you end up in the open window, down here, if you hit the Set Project button, look what happens. This pops open the same thing you would go to in the File menu anyway. So like kind of like what Elijah's saying, if you just do Control O, click right there, you're already in the process of setting a project. And then when you close out of this, the open menu is already open. So it's all kind of located in the same area this way. So I'm going to click on the character project. Remember, don't click inside of it or on any of these guys. We want to make sure that we are selecting just the main folder. Set. And you can see as soon as I do that, see how the open menu just kind of changed. It happened really quick, so you guys may have not noticed it. But it's now defaulting to that project folder. And then I can simply go to Scenes and open whatever file I feel like I need to use for the project. So in this case, I'd be using the camera file because that's the last thing you guys worked on. So character cam. I have a bunch of other ones in here that we haven't talked about yet, but you guys will be doing this stuff over the next couple weeks. All right, let's open it up. Yep, I got my cameras. So I'll just show you what mine look like. I'm going to do the split view just so you can kind of see this. So over here, I got my split view. Let's make this one the front. We'll have this be the angled. So this is the same project that you guys saw where I was kind of building the reference images from. So there's my setup. Things are named, fairly straightforward. In the render settings, all the resolution's already set. So we're kind of good to go with that. What I'm going to do is keep one of these to perspective for now, because I want to have one as my camera view, so I can always swap this out for either camera if I just need to see what they look like. But I want to make sure I do have one viewport that's just kind of hanging out and ready for my normal work, like me moving around, clicking on things, moving objects around, whatever I got to do. I want to make sure I still have this guy available, and so it's not just 2 different cameras. All right, now the first thing we want to do over here is you can see we've got the character file open. We set the project. We open the cam file. We're just building upon the previous one. Now, if you guys wanted to, you could save the file immediately. Maybe not override the camera file. If you scroll down a little farther, yeah, I'm kind of skipping down to step 6, and I'll show you why. Because I just want you guys to see what we're naming the file eventually. So see how when you're done with all this, it says save your Maya file as characterchallenge.mb. So this is after you're done with everything. But as you guys know, you don't want to save this way at the end. Because what happens if you do half the activity and then like Maya crashes or your laptop loses power and shuts down? I don't know. something catastrophic happens, right? You're going to lose information, and you don't really want to save over the same file because you might need to go back to the original. So as long as we know what it's eventually going to be called for the turn in, what I could do is right off the bat, let's just immediately save this as a new one. Okay, so I would go in there and save that as character challenge. And I already have one in here, so I'm not going to save over it, but I would save it as character challenge, save it. And that way I know that this one is already saved as a separate file. I still have the camera file if I want to go back to it and start from scratch. And if I start going through the activity, because it's already set up as a different file, I could just start saving as I go through this. And I could do incremental saves where I could be like, character challenge 1, character challenge 2. I could save it each step, and then by the time I get to the end, we might be at like character challenge 10 or whatever, depending on how many times you saved it. And I just know whatever the most recent one is, that's the one you're going to copy for the turn in. Hopefully that makes sense the way I'm explaining that, but don't feel like you always have to work off the one file. I would definitely encourage you guys to have multiple saves of your steps. That way it's always easy for you to go back and fix something without redoing the entire activity. Okay, so let's do the very first part. I'm going to actually skip past the front one because I have the angled one visible right now. We're going to skip all the way down to step 5. The front, this part right here for the front camera and the angled camera are basically identical. So what I'm going to do is kind of work with this one, but everything I'm talking about for this guy still applies for the one up here. Okay, so we'll start with angled. We're going to be on step 5. The main goal is we're just trying to make a couple backgrounds for the camera file. That's pretty much it. Each camera should have its own background. So we're going to make a polyplane, put it in the right location, make sure it's aiming towards the camera. We're going to name things properly, and then eventually we're going to put it on a display layer so I can turn the background on and off. So we're just starting with the camera file, and we're going to add some stuff to it. Okay. So what I'm going to do is go to the poly modeling part in the shelf. This is the same thing you guys were doing back in the very first activity when you were showing me how to move around Maya. So there's our polygon plane. You can also do these right here if you want. But we'll just click, and you can see in the outliner, because I have the outliner open, I'm getting this little item that just popped up that says P-plane 1, polyplane 1. I'm going to immediately rename it so it matches what we're seeing in the documentation. So this should be character BG angled. So let's do that. Okay, so in the outliner, we can double click, just like you guys were renaming characters, or your cameras, sorry. Character BG angled. So I'm just naming the object. Now, where is it? You guys remember how before when you made your cameras, how they were all kind of being created underneath the stand? Because that just happened to be where the center of the 3D scene is. So what we're going to do is with it selected, we're going to hit W, and we're going to move it back. And let's just move it up a little bit. And I'm just doing this with perspective view. I'm not really seeing it over here yet. It's kind of off to the side. But let's hit R and also scale it up. I just want you guys to see what this looks like. This is our polyplane. It's incredibly interesting, very flat, not much detail to it, which is totally fine. All I need to do is get this in a position where it looks like it's a background behind the character. So the best way to kind of think about this is you guys all remember like going through high school and when they would take your like yearly photos, they had like the photographer come in and there was like that little backdrop behind you where they'd put like some like gradient or like a beach. Mine were always, I had this really kind of cool one when I was going through high school where I'd always pick the lasers, and there was like these crossing neon pink and blue lasers behind me for my for my photos. That's kind of what we're doing here. We're just trying to set up a backdrop behind the character. So eventually when we add lights and take our image and create our photo from this, I need there to be something back there so it's just not black and empty. I want something to bounce light. I want something to react with the lighting and catch shadows. I need something there. That's why we're doing this. So when I hit W, I can just move it over, and you can see it's updating in the other view. So this is kind of a good time for me to use the free transform. Now, you know how before in some of my videos I've told you guys to be careful about grabbing from the middle and doing this? This is one of those cases where grabbing from the middle is okay. Because what I want to do is through the camera, just click in the middle of that little transform manipulator, and I'm just going to try to center it visually as close as I can. Like right around here feels pretty close. Now the reason I'm doing that is because now if I rotate it, so I'm going to use E, we're just going to rotate it with X just to tilt it upright. Remember too, you can also type in rotational values in the channel box if it's selected. So if we know that we want to have it stand perfectly upright, you can see right here with rotate X, because I've been turning it, we're about like 80, or so degrees. We could say 90 degrees, and it will stand perfectly upright. Okay, now I can use E again, rotate with Z. I'm just going to turn it towards the camera. So I'm just kind of getting it so that line is facing towards us. And now we need to make it bigger, right? So R, let's grab the side, scale it out. I'm going to center it in a little bit. We're going to scale it taller. So we're just making it big enough to fit. And right around here is pretty good. You don't have to have it perfect, but I'm just going to nudge it over a little bit. Let's also just move it up very, very slightly. And if you wanted to like nitpick this a little, obviously mine is probably a little like tilted back. Like I could probably try to tilt it forward just slightly because the camera is probably not completely level, but something like that does work pretty well. Now the only thing about this is when you set up your little background, and it looks pretty good, you want to make sure that it fills the resolution gate, and I would be careful about the distance that it's from the object, because if you're not really paying attention to this view, if you're just looking at this right here, I want you to see what will happen if I had it a lot closer. So let's say that we had this. Visually, if you did something like this, like if you didn't see the perspective view, if this is the only thing you were seeing, this would look correct. And you'd be like, cool, I did it. It's a background. But when you see it in perspective, and by the way, if you're wondering what I'm doing, this is me hitting spacebar. So if you hit space over a view when you're in split, it just maximizes that view, and I hit space and it goes back to the split view. So that's just me hitting spacebar. But you'll notice that it's intersecting right through the poor head. That's going to be a bigger issue later when I start adding lights, because this means I can't actually put anything behind the head to light it without it being blocked by the wall. So we're going to push this probably a little farther back, somewhere around here, maybe even a bit farther is okay. R, I'm just going to scale it up a little larger, because as I push it back, obviously I need to make it bigger so it still fills the frame. So now this looks visually like it's going to fill everything. Anything outside of that resolution gate really doesn't matter for what we're doing. It's still technically empty. There's not really a floor or a ceiling, but it's still going to be fine. This is at least the main thing we wanted to do. So far it's pretty easy, right? Make a plane, move it as a background, name it, not too bad. From here, what we're going to do is move on to the next part with the background. Okay, so now that we have it in a pretty good spot, we're going to add it to a new display layer. This is going to be new for you guys. What's the display layer? We're going to rename it, and then we're just going to make sure that the display layer works, which means we're going to hit the little visibility checkbox on it and just turn it on and off just to make sure the background is working. So display layers are down here. You can only see them if you're in the channel box. So remember in the first video you guys did for the class when I was having you go through some of like the basic UI elements and you were trying to figure out, okay, where's the channel box, where's the attribute editor? The channel box, you'll notice, is not just channel box. This tab is called channel box / layer editor. This section down here is the layer editor. And there's two types of layers you can create. There is a display layer, and there's what's called an animation layer. And I don't know, you guys are going to get animation layers, most likely. I don't know when. This is probably going to be something way farther down the road, so I'm not going to get into too much detail with this. But this is sort of related to, I'm trying to think of the best way to explain it. Imagine you've got different types of animations for a character and you want to blend between them. You know how like with video games, like you've probably seen how when people do animations for characters, they're done in cycles. Like there's just a run cycle where it just loops forever. There's like a different animation when the character needs to go to like a standing pose or a like a crouching position. Basically, this sort of does something kind of like that, where if you animate the different types of cycles or poses, you can use this to blend between them and control which layer is the pose that we're seeing in the viewport. But we're not going to get into that. That'll be a fun thing for you guys to play around with when you get to some of your character animation classes. We are using display layers, and these have a ton of different purposes. They're very, very cool. We're going to use these again in shading and lighting too. But the main idea with these is you're going to make a layer, we're going to assign this to it, and we're just going to use the layer to color code a couple things in the viewport and make sure that we can turn the background's visibility on and off. So normally, if you guys wanted to turn something on and off, you could find it in the outliner and hit H. All right, so if I just hit H with that object selected, H is my shortcut to hide and unhide. We're going to do this a little bit differently with the display layer. So what I want you to do is click on the background. Now we have two options over here on the right. We have the first one, which is create a new layer. And then we have another one, which is create a new layer and assign the selected object. Let's do the one on the right first. So this is the one probably most of you guys are going to pick. So I'm going to hit create a new layer and assign the selected object, meaning this has to be selected when you hit the button on the right. I'm just going to hit it, and it's not going to look like much changed, but what you'll notice is that we have something here called layer 1. But everything in the viewport looks the same, right? Here's how you verify that you did it right. On layer 1, there are 3 different buttons right in the middle. There's a V, P, and this one right here is called template and render mode, but this is the main one you want to hit on the left side, V. V is for visibility. Is it visible? So notice when I turn that off, the plane disappears. It's not hidden like I hit H on it. It's me turning it off with the layer. So I'm hiding anything on this layer. If it's off, you don't see it. If the layer is on, you see whatever is on the layer. Now I want to name this thing. So if I look back at the documentation, we can see, all right, so it's working. I need to rename it still. We haven't done that. And then optionally, I could change the layer colors. Let's try it out. So over here, if I double click on where it says layer, you'll see a little rename thing pop up. Layer 1. Let's rename it. This is going to be, was it character BG layer or angled? BG. Oh, I totally didn't rename that. It's supposed to be BG angled layer. I'll fix that. BG angled layer. Save. So I've just renamed it. That still works. And the color coding thing, if you double click on it, you guys probably noticed there were all these little colors down here. You can pick whatever you want. Like I'll do maybe, we'll just choose this little kind of cyan color over there. Hit save. You can see it has a little color on it. So it'll color the different layers for you. They do show up in the viewport, but you don't see the color in the viewport until you have wireframes on. So remember when you guys were showing me like the wireframe and shaded buttons back in the first week, which are 4 and 5. See how when I go to 4, this wireframe looks different. And if I do wireframe on shaded, it also shows up a little bit different. I don't know why that is going to wireframe mode. Oh wait, that is not wireframe mode. That is shaded. Wow. It is so thick, it looks like you can't even see the shading. That is very dense. So that's going to color code the wireframe. So if you wanted to, you could also put these on display layers. We could do it again for practice. You're totally, you can do that if you want, just to play around with it. So let's say we want to add these guys also to a display layer. I'm going to have 2 things selected this time, but this time I'm going to do it a little bit differently because I want to show you this other button as well, just so you understand how this one works. This is if you want to make a layer without assigning anything to it. So if I just hit the other button, it's still going to look really similar. It makes a layer. It doesn't really seem that different. Let's call this maybe Nefertiti model, I guess. And we'll give this maybe this kind of like maroon looking color right there. So I have like this dark reddish kind of maroon tone. And if I go to wireframe, you can see nothing's happening. Why is it not maroon? Because this one right here was me making an empty layer, but nothing is on it. So it's sort of like in Photoshop, if you guys make a new layer but don't do anything with it, that's kind of what's happening right now. There's nothing on the layer. But in this case, we can still add stuff to the layer. So if you want to add stuff to it, like let's say we just want to add just the Nefertiti head, if you click on it and then right click on the layer with it selected, you'll notice that right clicking on the layer has a bunch of different options that pop up. Like I can add objects to it, I can remove objects that I'm selecting, I can delete the layer. There's a bunch of things we can do. Now I'm going to add this to the layer. So if that's selected, I right click on that layer and I'm going to pick add selected objects. Boom. I do it. And now if I turn the V off, see how now it thinks the head's on the layer? And you can see that it turns on and off. If I go to wireframe, there's the color. So we can also color code that way too, which could be kind of fun for you guys if you like to organize your projects like that. You can also change layer order. That's what these guys are right here. This is just select a layer, move it down, move it up. I only have 2 layers, so you can't really do a whole lot with this, but you can change layer order if you want to. And if you mess it up, like let's kind of pretend we screwed this thing up. I'm going to add the stand to the background layer. And then later, see how it's the color, right? And then when I'm going through this, I realize like, oh crap, like I didn't mean to have that on there. This shouldn't have been with the background. This is supposed to be its own thing. As long as that's selected, just like I added an object to a layer, remember you can also remove an object. So you just simply select it, hit right click on the layer and remove it. It'll get rid of it. And now the layer is no longer affecting that stand. So it's super easy to add and remove things, create the layers, reorganize them, rename them. I don't think you guys are going to have too many issues with that. And if you ever make a layer and you want to delete it, like let's say I made a couple layers and I just didn't mean to, you can right click and say delete layer and that will also remove it. So fairly straightforward, right? Now the reason why I'm having you guys do this, you might be wondering why are we going through all this extra hassle to do all these layers. We're going to be using layers a lot in shading and lighting too. So this is just, I want you guys to be exposed to how these work. But the other important thing with this particular month is because you have 2 cameras. So remember, eventually you will be also creating renders or images from the front cam. Now look what's happening when I look through the front camera. That guy's visible. Because we're using a different camera, I don't want this background visible. There should be a different background setup that works with this camera angle. So you really, like, that's kind of the part I skipped over at the beginning. The whole part with the front cam is you basically doing the same thing again, where you're just centering it, rotating it. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but, positioning it. It'd be on a new layer. So eventually when you set this up properly, you can turn this one on and off when you want to look through the front camera to create an image. As soon as you're ready to create an image from the angled cam, we turn that background off and turn this background on. So you're really just using it as a way to toggle which backdrop should be visible for the camera you're using for that particular moment. That's all it's set up to do. Okay? If you have any questions about that, let me know. Really not too bad. And the videos and the activity will explain all this display layer stuff in a lot more detail. So I think you guys will feel pretty good about that after you go through the videos. And once you get all those guys set up, you are done with the character file. So when I go in there, I'm just looking for like naming, making sure if I turn the layers on and off, the background's disabled properly. I'm checking to see that it fills the resolution gate. Did you name the objects in the outliner? All the kind of fairly simple standard stuff I look for. All right. Let's move on to the environment. This one's not too bad. It's a lot of steps, but you can see it's not really too difficult. Oh, I do want to show you one thing real quick before I get into the environment project you guys are working on. Because since we're on the topic of display layers, I do want to show you kind of why this is important. This is a project from the second shading and lighting class, but I just want you to see this real quick. This will help, hopefully, convey why these display layers are so important. Okay, so in shading and lighting 2, eventually you guys are going to be working with this scene right here. I'm sure this all looks very familiar, like it's the same set. I've added a couple things to it, but it's essentially the same thing. Um, when you're dealing with a larger scene that has a lot of different pieces, and this isn't even really that big, there's going to be a lot of cases where you're trying to select multiple objects over and over again. Like let's say, like for this one, let me show you what I'm talking about. I have all these little like um, hinges and things that are used to open and close the door. They're all over the place. There's like hinges there, there's this there, they're on this side, on the inside of the wall. There's some for the shutters on the interior. I got latches over here. So there's a lot of different pieces that kind of all like would end up using the same material. And eventually you might want to select all these pieces to maybe put like a some type of metal material on it. Like you find this really cool preset that you're like in RenderBand. It's called a I don't know like a rusted iron material. You want to put it on all the objects, and you start realizing that the only way to do that is if you first select all the objects to put the material on it. And then you start zooming in, and you're like, oh man, I gotta select all the objects that need the metal. And you start the long process of hand selecting everything. I'm holding shift and just clicking on things one by one. Then you go down here, you hold shift and you're still clicking. And you can imagine how easy this is to misclick, click on a frame, click on the door, right? And just think how long this would take to eventually select everything you want just so you can put the right material on it. It's painful, right? That does not sound like a fun time for anybody. But if you take the time to add these to a display layer, like I've done for this project here in Shading and Lighting 2, notice how when I turn this little hinges and bolts layer on and off, see how all those little pieces disappear? You can also see the ones on the window on the right also disappearing. So I added all these to a layer for my students because once you set it up once, if you ever need to select all these random objects again to do something to them, if you right click on the layer, there's another option here we haven't talked about called Select Objects. Watch what this does. That automatically selected every single object on the layer. That means I could now very quickly with the click of a button select, go to like an area where I'm making materials, put on a metal material, check it out in the image. If I don't like it, right click, select the objects, all the objects again, put a different material on it. And so it's a little bit of setup for the first time you do it, but once you get those groups and layers set up for you in an activity, it means down the road, it's so much easier to start selecting and controlling things in these much more complicated activities. So that's kind of a big reason why I'm showing you guys this today for the first class, because you're going to see it again in the second month. And I think a lot of you are just going to end up liking these a lot anyway, where you're probably going to want to have these be just a natural part of your workflow for any project. So they're very, very handy. Okay, let's move on to the environment. So we're going to start this one from scratch, just like we did with the character project. So this one says open Maya. We don't need to do that. We're already in Maya, but set the project to the environment project folder, which you guys already set up. Open the environment cam from the last activity. This would be activity 1.3. And then we're going to move down here and import our new object and just talk about how groups work and how we can open and close a couple things. So we're going to do, let's do it the same way I did last time. So I'm going to do Control O, set project. Let's find my project folder. I think this is it. Yep, that's it. Set, scenes. This would be environment cam. We're going to open that up. Should have the cameras in here. Cool. Yep, I got my two cameras. I've told a couple of you guys about this, but just in case I didn't catch this with a couple of you guys. So how many, like for those of you in the live session with me today, how many of you noticed this black color issue? Do you know if you noticed this and kind of had a mini panic attack about something not looking right, do you know why it's doing this? Because it's not broken. And some of you, I may have talked to you already about this, but I want to make sure you guys understand what this is and why it's black. There is a reason. Yep, it's the background for the interior. So let me show you an example here. I'm just going to duplicate the roof real quick. And I'm just going to use R to scale it up a little bit so I can get the camera inside of there. So this is just a polycube. I mean, it's extremely simple. Oh, I'm also going to fix one other thing real quick because I noticed I have an issue with the camera. So notice how when I back up, see all this weird, like these like weird artifacts happening right here where it's like pulsing? That's an issue with the perspective camera that we're going to fix real quick. If you click on your perspective camera in the outliner, go into the attribute editor. So these are the camera's attributes. There's one right here called near clip plane. You don't have to do this for the activity, but I just want you guys to know how to fix this little graphical issue if it bothers you. The near and far clip plane determine how far the camera can see in distance and how close things can get to the camera. What you're seeing is an issue with the viewport, for whatever reason, when I back up really far, is struggling trying to draw all the objects behind other objects. So things are starting to like kind of, it's called Z fighting, but it's different objects layered behind each other are starting to compete for space, and the software is having a really hard time understanding what's in front of what. But if you click on the camera, go to your attributes, right there, change the near clip from 0.01 to 0.1. So we're just removing the 0. We're going up a decimal place. Hit enter. That will clean up most of the artifacts for you. And it'll eventually pop up again if you go really far back, but you shouldn't need to be this far away. So again, that's camera. Change that from 0.01 to 0.1. That'll clean up that little weird issue right there, and then you're good to go. All right, let's go back here. But back to this little black issue. This is something that you guys have seen before if you've ever been inside one of the objects with your camera. So if I go inside the cube, look what happens. See how it's all black in here? It's kind of weird, right? We're in the cube. This is what the back side of a piece of geometry looks like. So if let me just delete the top off it so you can see inside of it. So see how from one side, like it looks gray and shaded and it kind of reacts with light and it's all pretty. But as soon as you see inside of the object on the other side of the face, it looks completely black. That is normal because each face, like all these guys, these don't have a thickness. And so whenever you see this sort of infinitely thin component from the other side, what Maya does is it uses this thing called normals to tell the camera, which is what we're looking through, what way is the front direction. Like which side of the plane is supposed to be the front? Is it supposed to be the inside? Is it the outside? And when you see it from the wrong side, it just looks black. Now, the reason why I'm using this in the room is because I'm using a trick with something called backface culling to allow us to see into the interior. So to fix this, in the viewport, go to the shading menu, and then down here, turn on backface culling. This is a setting per camera, by the way. So if you have a different camera where you can see that, you have to do it in a different camera. So backface culling. As soon as I turn it on, look what happens. See how you can see inside the interior? Because this wall, see how it's a thin plane? There's no thickness to it. It's very similar to the box thing I was showing you guys earlier, where if you see it from the wrong side, it looks black. But with backface culling on, it's kind of a cool trick where instead of the viewport drawing it black, instead it will treat it like it's transparent and it's see-through. So when you can see through it from the back side, but when you see it from the front, it looks completely normal. And something that you guys have probably seen before if you've done like random video games. Like if you've done maybe, I don't know, like a first-person shooter, you put your character in the wrong location. Like Skyrim was notorious for this, where if you get your guy wedged into behind a building or in the wall, it looks like you're stuck in the wall, but then you can somehow see through it to the other side. That's basically what you're seeing right here. It's used a lot in game levels just to reduce how many polygons are on some of the objects. So there you go. Anyway, now you know that. Let's try doing some of this activity. So I want to bring in the telescope file. So this is the thing that you guys downloaded from the previous activity. We're going to translate, rotate, scale it into position, move it on the balcony. Want to make sure it's not intersecting through the floor. Get the scale of it right. Make sure it's not floating. And then we're going to try to turn it. So we're going to use a turn group to turn the telescope based on our composition for the camera. And I also want to use the tilt group to aim it upwards towards the sky. And the main idea with this is I just want you guys to understand how to import assets and also how to use groups. So groups are pretty powerful inside of Maya. So let's bring in the model first and see what it looks like. So I'm going to go to File, Import, and then we're going to look for the telescope, which is in the Assets folder of the project. So there it is. Import. Okay, hit Continue. So we're importing another prop or another element into this scene. And you can see that it's here, and you'll notice if you just spin the camera around, you may never notice it, by the way, if you don't have this turned off because you can't see it, but it is appearing inside the interior because, again, there's that grid. This just happens to be the center of the 3D world for this Maya file. So there it is. Now all I'm going to do is click on the group. Now be careful about this because if you click on, it's kind of hard to select it unless you get inside because you're going to keep clicking on the wall. But if you click on each piece and move it, you are moving that one object. So be careful about that. You want to click on the group in the outliner. Okay, now W, move it out. We're going to move it over just like that. And you can see that we're already moving it towards the balcony. We'll move it forward a little bit. And there's our telescope. I see no problems whatsoever, right? Doesn't that seem great? Now imagine you're the person opening up the doors and walking out to this beast. It is massive. You can't even reach it to tilt it. You're basically getting up on a ladder just to use the darn thing. So we need to scale this thing down because now that we're starting to combine different models and assets together, we can tell that for some reason, when this was modeled, it was not modeled to the correct scale, right? So how do we fix that? With the group, if you hit R, we can now scale the entire group down. You'll notice that the scale, which is kind of interesting, let me show you this again. See how when I'm clicking around, how the little manipulator isn't centered on the object, which is kind of weird, right? Like, why is this manipulator here? Why is that one in the center? This one seems to be there, but if I click on the group, it's not in the middle of the group, it's at the bottom. So you can always move around pivot points, and I've already, because I modeled this thing, I already moved the pivot point near the bottom of the telescope. So that way when I scale it, it scales to where the legs are. So as long as you get the position of the legs correct, and see how right now it might look okay, but let me show you what it looks like from the inside. The legs are sticking through the floor. You can't see the bottom of the leg yet. So let's just really quickly use W and move it up. I'm going to have to get the camera pretty low to see this. Right about there. That looks pretty good. It's probably floating just barely, but somewhere around there is pretty close, right? Doesn't have to be perfect, but we'll go with that. So I'm getting it positioned, and now if I hit R, because I have the camera's pivot point moved here, or the group's pivot point moved, if I scale it from the middle, see how it shrinks and the legs are still on the ground? Because if I had the pivot point, I'm going to move it on purpose. Let's just move this up. Normally it would be like up here somewhere. Oh, actually, I'll show you guys the way you probably have done it before. You might have used this when you're doing the first activity. Do you remember me talking about like the center pivot, delete history, freeze transform stuff? This is the center pivot. It'll put it to the center, but see how if I scale it now, how it's making it smaller, but how the legs aren't contacting the ground because it's scaling towards the manipulator. But if you move the pivot, and I've already done this for you, but by moving it, when I scale it, now the legs stay in the same spot, and I'm able to shrink it down without changing if the legs are floating or intersecting through the ground. So the legs are always in the perfect spot. And if you ever want to change the pivot point, I'll just show you guys this real quick. We'll do it with this guy. Let me just move this out so you can see it. So let's just pretend that this is like an object and you want to change the pivot. If you know how W is like your move tool, if you hold down D, see every time I hold down the D key, this little thing pops up. D, when you have the D key down, you're moving the manipulator. You're not moving the actual object. So I could hold D, move it back here somewhere. See how it's farther back? And now if I release D, when I go to move this object, it's based on this position, which means if I rotate it, see how it's arcing around that center spot right there? Because I'm moving the middle point, the pivot point. You don't have to do any of that. I just wanted you guys to see what it is. Yes, that's correct. Yep, you are using the same character and environment project, the same files that you guys did from 1.3. So pretty much everything builds on itself through the whole month. You guys did the cameras first, then you set up the project folders, put all the camera files in there, and then for this one, you're opening up the camera file from last week and you're adding a bunch of stuff to it. All right, so let's scale this down. I think somewhere around like anywhere from between like maybe 0.55 scale to like 0.65 is probably an okay range to be in. So I'll let you guys kind of decide what you want to do for your scale. Just make sure when you are scaling it that you don't scale with the individual handles like this. See what happens when you do that? You're breaking the proportions of the model. So we want to do a uniform scale. So even if you mess that up, like let's say I started doing that and I'm like, I don't know what happened. I flattened the poor telescope. How do I fix it? The issue is just because you grab those individual scale handles and you can see over here what it's doing. The scale is 0.582 in one of them, 0.261, 0.742. As long as you just keep the numbers the same, it'll pop back to the original position. Like I could manually drag through these guys to select all of them and type in 0.6 and it'll pop back and it'll look totally fine again. But the clicking in the middle is the way you ensure that all the numbers move together. But again, don't forget, you can manually type in numbers if you need to. That's a good way to like fix it just in case you did squash it and you notice that one of the numbers are a little different. Not a big deal. Type it in so it's the same. It'll look totally fine again. So there's the telescope. Now I'm going to do a split view and I want to show you what this looks like through one of the cameras. So I'm going to use this front one. This is one of the cameras I'm using later in the month when we talk about lighting. So you guys have cameras set up. My recommendation would be, out of the cameras you built, kind of focus on one that you think you're going to use later when you start creating some of your images. I would have that be the one that you use to figure out where you want to place the telescope. So, for example, for me, what I would do is looking at this. This is a shot that's basically built symmetrically. Like it's centered perfectly down the middle. There's no angle to it. Like it's the same weighting on both sides. So to me, this screams the telescope should be in the middle, because I think if it's off center, it just makes the whole shot feel kind of unbalanced because everything else was set up to be centered. So what I would do is probably try to center the telescope to the best of my ability, looking through that camera. I'm just moving it side to side until it looks about in the middle. Now the distance, that's kind of up to you. Like I don't think it really matters for this one, you can't see much depth anyway, but we'll maybe put it right there. Now, once you get it in the right spot, there are a few things you may want to do to the group. So here you'll notice that we can find the telescope turn group, and we're going to try to turn it and eventually tilt it with the tilt group. So here's what the groups look like in the outliner. So over here, it's a little hard to see probably in the video recording that we're doing, but notice how, like when you have a regular object, there's this little icon that looks like a polygon, like a little polyplane. The group is different. The group has this thing that's called a transform icon. It's a little, like a parallelogram with an arrow pointing into it. But what you'll notice is to the left of the little group icon, there's a plus symbol. When you hit it, watch what happens. It shows you all these other things that you couldn't see. Let me hit it again on minus to collapse it. So hitting that little button to the left of the group name and icon will unhide and hide what's in the group. So you can start digging inside of it and finding out, okay, what's in here? I have a turn group. This is one of the things we need. Here's like a stand, there's a bolt, a screw. I've got leg groups over here that are in here, chains connecting down at the base. So turn group is one of the ones I was talking about. And if you zoom in and look at turn group, I'm going to hit F on the camera just so I can see this a little bit easier. So this is the group for the entire telescope. This is the group for just the top part. And if I hit E to rotate, look at where the rotation is based off of. See how it's centered right where that little connection is? Because if I now turn it, it's pivoting and moving just like it should in real life. So I have this group set up so the entire top part of the telescope, you can turn it with this group as long as you can find it and rotate the entire top without breaking any of the geometry. Okay, so from the camera, I might not want to have it like centered. I think this might be a good case where I could like turn it a little bit and maybe do something like a really cool dynamic silhouette from the side. So I'm going to turn it quite a bit, maybe almost like 90 degrees, so we have a nice side angle. So it's really good silhouette at this point. And that's the turn group. Now you want to be careful though, because if you don't use rotate X, if you end up grabbing from the middle, let me just zero this out again. Watch what happens if you just click in the middle and start rotating this way. You can do this and turn it, and it might look fine from the camera's view, but when you get up close, you can tell something really wrong has happened. It's not connecting with the bolt properly. It's going through the other piece of geometry. That doesn't look good. It's like we basically busted the object. And I understand from like a distance, they would never know this because we're way too far back to tell. But I will notice it because I'm going in your project to see if we have it rotated properly. So we want to be very careful with how we rotate some of these groups. It should only be able to pivot and rotate this direction. It should not be able to tilt back, and it should not be able to tilt side to side. Those are going to break it. So only use rotate Y. I'm going to do negative, we'll do like negative 90, I guess, for this. So I'm just turning it perpendicular. Okay? Now you'll notice that in the documentation, it also said to find tilt group. This is the one that's going to tilt it upwards. So what I'm looking for is another group. So we had the full group for the telescope. I had the group inside of that. That's the top for the turn group. And notice this is a group. Hit the plus on turn group, and you will notice there is another group inside of there called telescope tilt group. This is just the top part. So see how this is the top and that little bracket and arm? This is just the top. If I use E, what rotation should we do for this one? It's only meant for tilting. So the only thing I should be using here is rotate X. And we're just going to tilt it up and get something kind of like that. And now we're aiming it upwards. And because all these groups kind of work well together, even if you tilt that up, if you go back to turn group, I can still turn it, and that other tilt still reacts completely fine. I can still grab the overall group. I can still move this around. It doesn't break anything else inside of it. The only group that gets a little weird, which I would not recommend messing with, there are legs. These can collapse down, and you can do this to like fold it in, like if someone was going to pick up the telescope and go. The only thing about this thing is I didn't set up dynamics on it, and so you'll notice when I rotate, like see this little chain connection down here in the center, how it's all being held together. I can rotate it in. Nothing is telling the chain what to do because this involves like a lot of like complicated dynamics and like probably hair systems to get this thing to collapse and fold properly. That looks terrible. I didn't set any of that stuff up for you because it's a little bit too complicated. So please don't rotate the legs. It's going to look bad. I didn't set any of that up. But the other part's pretty straightforward. So that's what you're doing for the telescope. The only thing I'm not really covering with you guys for this project is the last part before you kind of wrap everything up. The other section is opening up the door shutters. The shutters are the pieces behind the doors, not the doors themselves. Now, if you want to open the doors too, I'm fine with you doing that. I'm just not grading that part. You can also open up the window shutters. That's, again, optional. But I at least want to make sure you guys find these. So they're pretty straightforward. As long as you guys know how to find your groups like this, you eventually will be able to find the shutters. They're also in groups. They're just in the original group that the whole environment is kind of combined into. So they're in there. If you just click on one shutter, you will eventually find the group. Because see how when I click around in here, if you have the group open, like watch that little area that's highlighting. I'm just going to click around in the interior. See how the highlighting thing is changing? When you click on a shutter, you can see where that object is located. So this is somewhere in this door window master group. So the door window master group is this whole piece. But if you go in there and you keep digging, like I'll click on it again, door window shutter group. Let's go in door window shutter group 2. There's the door window shutter geometry. So you can see this whole thing is just groups and groups and groups. It's like the Russian nesting doll. There's tons of these guys. Now you want to be careful because if you do accidentally rotate or move the shutter by itself, see how it doesn't really rotate properly, right? It's just spinning in place. It doesn't move with all the little hinges. But if you find the group, because I already set this up, as soon as you figure out which group it is, you will be able to rotate the group and it will open and close properly. So thankfully, you guys don't have to worry about any of that. I did all the setup. You just have to find the right group and figure out how to rotate them to make all the objects move properly. And be careful, too, that you don't go through the wall. We've had a few people that just do this to open it, and before you know it, you got the shutter just blowing right through the interior wall. And you may also, just like a recommendation, if you open these up, I would also recommend rotating this because it's no longer latched in that little loop on the opposite shutter. You could also rotate that down just so it's hanging, vertically, and letting gravity pull that down. Because it's a little bit weird if it's just kind of floating. Okay, and you're doing that with this one too. Again, find the group. There is a shortcut, by the way. I kind of want you guys to try digging through these first, just so you understand how it works and how you can find stuff. But there is a shortcut. I typically do it this way. If you click on a shutter and on your keyboard hit the up arrow, that will navigate up the hierarchy to the group that object was in. So like if I click on this piece and hit up, that's the group for the door frame. Here's the shutter, hit up arrow, E, I'm now rotating the group that the shutter was in. It's a lot easier that way, but I really want you guys to like try finding stuff in groups by like opening and closing things just so you kind of learn how to navigate through the outliner first before you start relying on hitting the up arrow and for everything. But once you get used to the other method, you're totally more than welcome to use the up arrow if you want to use that as a shortcut to get to the group. And that's pretty much it. So for your turn-in, you're turning in the character file with the modifications, the environment file with all the telescope in there, rotating a couple things. You're naming them character challenge and environment challenge. They're different. They're going to be saved as different Maya files, so don't save over your camera file. Because remember, you want to be able to go back to that just in case you want to like redo it, like if there's anything wrong with it. And if you guys are still making changes to the cameras based on my critique, do that before you start this project. That way the cameras are already good to go when you begin doing all the modifications. Okay. I think that kind of covers things. Oh, you know what? Real quick, I do want to show you how to make a group because I'm sure you guys are probably wondering, like, the groups are cool and all, but like, how do you do it? Like, how do you actually make a group? I have a video on it, but let me just show you this real quick because it's pretty easy if you guys want to play around with it in your free time. I'm just going to do it with a couple like simple shapes. So let's say you have a cube. I'm going to duplicate it with Control D, Control D again. So I'm just using duplicate, which is right there. Let's duplicate the object. So I have 3 cubes, and I just want to group them together. Grouping, if you select all your objects you want to group, you can also do it in the outliner. It's right there. That's where I'm getting this group from. It's also Control G. So if I do Control G, see how it made a group, just like we did up here. You can rename it. If I hit W, see how the group's pivot point is back at the origin of the scene? It's not where the objects are, but if I group it and hit the center pivot button, which is also right there, hit center pivot, it'll go to the middle of all the objects in the group, and then if I rotate the group, they all move together. And it's a bunch of really cool things you can do with groups. You can also, like, if you start getting a little bit more comfortable with like moving the pivot point with like the D key, there's also something called vert snap, which is V. So V, what vert snap does, if I hold down V and drag the transform, see how it's snapping to something? This is called a vertex snap. It's trying to snap to the different like pieces that make up the other geometry in the scene. But when you get a little bit more comfortable with this, if I did something like hold D to move the pivot, I'm holding D and I'm holding V, so D and V are both down. I'm now going to move the pivot and vert snap the pivot to the corner of this cube right, if I can get it, right there. So if I rotate it, it's now pivoting on that corner. So that's actually the trick I did with a lot of these little like hinges, is I would group it and then I was using D and V to move the pivots and try to snap it to the center of that bolt. That way the doors would open in the correct location. So you're kind of seeing in a really rough way how that stuff was constructed, but you guys don't actually have to do any of that, but you can totally play around with it if you want to. Be kind of cool to experiment with some of that stuff. All right, guys, I think that's going to do it for the lecture. Just make sure you guys take your screenshot if you already haven't. You can turn that into 2.2 for credit for the activity. And then I'll send out the live session recording tomorrow as a message on the LMS. You can check out that for more information if you want to rewatch it. Aside from that, hope you all have a good night. And I will, if I don't talk to you over the weekend, I will talk to you probably next week at the Week 3 live session.